Can you give me a build? No, I fucking won't. I despise these words. Not because I think you're stupid or lazy, but because you can do better. When people ask for a build for a given ship, it makes my soul hurt. Because you don't need a ship-specific build. You can look at any build that falls within the same archetype that you want to fly and transpose it with ease. Because in the end, all builds within an archetype are fundamentally the same. They are composed of the same building blocks, Legos, Lincoln Logs, Mega Blocks, Technic, whatever the fuck you want to call them. The same discrete pieces of a puzzle all fit together in the same ways no matter what. Games have rules. Stow building has rules. The game just refuses to teach them to you. I mean, hell, it doesn't even know what half of those rules are. So I'm here to teach you. We're going to learn probably the most important fundamental anyone should have. The ability to read.
I don't understand.
You have to learn why things work on a starship. Each ship has its own combination code to prevent an enemy from doing what we're attempting.
Now, I know you know how to read. Well, I mean, most of you anyway. Considering the state of the U.S.'s education system, that's not actually a good bet anymore. But regardless, we're not talking about literacy here. Reading in this context is the ability to scan a ship and understand its capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses at a glance. With the ability to read, you can figure out exactly what can fit into the structure of a ship, and thus transpose most builds from one ship to another, and customize them to your taste with relative ease. I swear to God, so many of you look at things and just cannot contemplate the idea that you can take one bridge and put it on another with just some tweaks. There are 3 major build archetypes in Star Trek Online: directed energy weapon builds, kinetic builds, and science builds. Almost every other type out there falls under these umbrellas, or is a hybrid of the 3. Today, we're going to be using the framework of directed energy weapon builds, or DO builds for short. Now, I think this is pretty fucking obvious, but any ship can run a DO build successfully. It doesn't matter what the gun layout is, it doesn't matter what the console layout is, any ship can do this. This is because the core building blocks of a DO build function regardless of the platform. Because at their hearts, all ships are the fucking same. But Mara, I hear you cry, they're all so different. Different specializations, different seatings, different console layouts. You cannot possibly be serious. Oh yes, I am. None of that matters, because in the end, the core building blocks all plug in the exact same way. And these building blocks all intersect in one place, the nerve center of a ship, the bridge. When reading a bridge, we have to fit 3 primary building blocks: the firing sequence, the power chain, and a cooldown method. Everything else is secondary. So let's break these down. The firing sequence is primarily the combination of your chosen firing mode or modes and attack pattern beta. You want these paired and slotted on essentially every DO build. No ifs, ands, or buts. Attack pattern beta gives a damage resistance rating debuff to the targets you hit, and this is essential to damage application. Combined with the fact that it shares the same cooldown cycle as most firing modes, and you have a pretty fucking essential synergy. So much so that if you cannot fit your firing mode and attack pattern beta together, I'd say that you simply cannot use that firing mode. This is exceptionally rare, however, so you really won't run into this. After this pair is fit, you can add secondary abilities to your firing sequence. These include secondary firing modes for a torpedo like high yield and spread, or extra damage and debuff, or tac team for a little extra durability. It's worth noting that for a build that opts to use high yield torpedo, the command spec ability concentrate firepower would fall under the firing mode category for the purposes of evaluating a ship. Next is your power chain. This is a pairing of two emergency power abilities. They have a 30-second uptime and a 15-second shared cooldown, so you can overlap them every 15 seconds for 100% uptime on both. Generally, we use emergency powered weapons to keep your weapon subsystem fueled, to proc the core starship trait emergency weapon cycle, and to provide a small category 2 damage boost to energy weapons. Next, we use emergency powered engines to provide extra mobility and speed, as well as proc the emergency con hologram from the Phoenix store, an essential mobility tool. Now, some of you question why this is important, and it's kind of critical. This resets your evasive maneuvers ability whenever EP to E is hit and allows extreme positioning power. And before you ask why this is so important, let me remind you that the third letter in DPS stands for second. And when you can reduce the time on the field by moving fast, you increase your DPS substantially. Further, being able to reach the best firing positions as possible, as quickly as possible, is essential to maximizing your ship's capabilities. This game needs you to be places, and if you can be places faster, you're a better player. Also of note is the Starship trait Ship of the Line, which benefits from having 2 EP to X powers going off in cycle. It's more critical severity for each one hit, and critical severity is good, actually. Next, we choose a cooldown method. There are many ways to do this, so let's go over some of the common tools. First, let's look at Aux to Bat. Auxiliary to Battery is an engineering ability that on its own kind of really fucking sucks. It dumps your aux power to juice other subsystems, which isn't terribly desirable as aux is used for quite a lot of things. But we accept that loss because when you combine it with specific technician duty officers, it gains the effect of hitting all of your abilities with a substantial cooldown reduction whenever it goes off. With 2 copies of the power, that's every 10 seconds. This allows for an extremely tight ability cycle, guaranteeing max uptime on most abilities. With the advent of some other methods of cooldown reduction, this has fallen out of favor in well-developed builds, but is still an extremely good choice for lower budget or starter players. Photonic Officer is a science bridge officer ability that is dedicated to cooldown reduction. It has a 20 seconds for every 30 second uptime, or 66%, so it does have some gaps that leaves it unable to fully manage your cooldowns on its own, but there are ways to plug that hole. You can combine it with a single copy of Aux to Bat to create a method we call Photonic Officer to Bat, or PO to Bat. This covers that 10-second gap in uptime pretty handily, and it fits easily on ships with less engineering space. Lastly, the Boimler effect is a lockbox trait that gives a 17.5% chance for each bridge officer ability activated to set all abilities to their minimum cooldown. Using this alone is quite risky, but some people, myself included, do it. It's generally best practice, however, to combine it with something like Photonic Officer to cover any bad RNG. There are a few supplemental passive cooldown tools like Chronocapacitor Array that you can mix in to provide coverage where you need it, but I'm not going to cover all of them today. There's just too much. Once you've fit these 3 components, you can fill in the blanks with a number of secondary building blocks: damage, durability, dummy procs, and unconventional systems procs. Damage picks often include specialization powers, the most common of which are Miracle Worker powers, mixed armament synergies, and narrow sensor bands. And the Intel power overrides subsystem safeties. These are a passive boost to weapon damage. There are also direct damage powers that can be fit in, like Chemosite Lace Weaponry, Tractor Beam Catapult, or Very Cold in Space. These can be fit in if you have too much of their seeding type and need to fill in some blanks. There is also the sub-archetype of Dusai, which prioritizes having direct damage powers like a science build would. Durability picks include the quite strong reverse shield polarity, an ability that converts incoming shield damage into shield healing, Ox to the structural integrity field, a rapidly cycling heal that also provides resists, and hazard emitters, a heal over time that provides resists and cleanses hazards and damage over time effects. This isn't so much used for the heal, which is not terribly strong, but for the cleanse. Also worth mentioning is Suppression Barrage. While not a heal, it keeps you and your teammates alive longer by upgrading your weapons to reduce the damage output of targets hit. Dummy procs are abilities selected because they trip traits or set bonuses. These can be almost any ability, as there are a plethora of triggered traits and sets in this game. Common ones include firing modes that you aren't using to trigger competitive rep innervated impulse engines, or the damage boost from a starship trait like Cultural Conquest. The morphogenic 3-piece also triggers from firing modes, making it an excellent choice for free-to-play builds, which I know a lot of you use. Also in the free-to-play realm are jam sensors and tractor beam, which are used to trigger Pilvered Power, a budget lockbox starship trait. Now, technically a member of the dummy proc class, unconventional systems procs are critical to modern building and deserve to be separated out as their own module. Uncon is a lockbox personal space trait that cools down active universal consoles a small amount for every control ability that goes off. You fit in as many as you possibly can, often prioritized over the other secondary modes due to the sheer potency of this technique. Many specialization powers qualify alongside many of the vanilla science powers. Examples include Tractor Beam, Gravity Well, Chronometric Inversion Field, and Ionic Turbulence, though there are many more. Now, taking everything we've learned so far, let's see if we can apply that to a concept called transposition. You can take any bridge build and transpose it by identifying these building blocks and fitting them onto a new bridge as it can support it. This may mean deleting secondary weapon systems, rebalancing uncon and dummy procs, or abandoning or adding durability picks. But regardless, it is really trivial to make these modifications once you know what you're fucking doing. Now, let's look at an example here, alright? Here we have the bridge of my soloist mirror angle build. We're going to transpose it onto the bridge of the much less expensive Fleet Norway. The first thing to notice is that the Norway has more forced tactical seating than the angle. This inevitably means that there will be less space for uncon procs, so we're going to have to rebalance those. The cooldown method used here is a hybrid Boimler passive method, leveraging the new Elios console's passive cooldown boost and chronocapacitor array to cover the gaps. Therefore, no bridge space is required to plug in a cooldown method. However, one could easily fit in Photonic Officer into this build, but that would require sacrificing an uncon proc, which I personally find undesirable. So let's start doing the work of converting the bridge. First, we build our firing sequence. We simply copy over the positions of scatter volley and attack pattern beta. Really fucking simple. When we look at the Norway, we need to fit in a whole lot more tactical abilities than the angle has room for, so we look directly at uncon procs, dummy procs, and direct damage. There are no available uncon procs in the tactical seating of the Norway. There's no spec seating here that provides more controls, so we move on. We're using both Cultural Conquest and the Innervated engines here, so we slot in 2 dummy procs, Overload and Spread, to use with them. We still have room left over though, so we look to our tactical direct damage options, Chemosite Lace, Weaponry, and Tractor Beam Catapult. Next, let's look at our power chain. In this build, I make the choice not to use emergency power to weapons, as I choose not to use emergency weapon cycle or ship of the line here. Instead, I slotted override subsystem safeties for use with the meta console Fleet Power Network Array. Note that if I choose to do a full EP to X chain, I could use the Ensign Universal Seat to do so. We see, however, that the Norway's Intel seat is not on the engineering seat, so we instead fit an available unconventional systems proc. You could also choose to add durability in the form of reverse shield polarity, or full EP to X chain with EP to W. Lastly, we have a universal seat with Intel on it, and our science seat. The science seat can be moved 1-to-1, and the universal seat being Intel gets that copy of override subsystem safeties from the Engels Eng seat, as well as an unconventional systems proc and jammed sensors. And there we are, we've successfully transposed a build. All we had to do was identify the structure and make some alterations for the differences. This works for almost every ship. Some exceptions exist for very specific builds. For example, you can't use a specialization firing mode on ships that don't have the correct specialization. I think this is a little fucking obvious though, and it shouldn't present a problem if you use some goddamn sense. Now that we've managed the bridge, let's look at the next system, gear. Gear can be broken down into 3 major groups: durability, damage, and utility. Further, they can be broken down into active and passive. Gear and set bonuses can have always-on passive stats or manually activated abilities that have a duration or a shot that require a cooldown period. Active consoles are favored when using unconventional systems and the extremely popular console from the 2024 summer event ship, the Voven. This console is Uncon on steroids and is capable of greatly cooling down active consoles. Durability picks are made for a pretty simple reason. You can't do a deeps if you're dead. Generally, you take only what you need to survive your damaged environment, leaving as much room as possible for damage and utility. Popular picks include Shield Absorptive Frequency Generator, the Discovery Deflector Engine Core Shield 2-piece, and the Dynamic Power Redistributor module, which also functions as a damage boost, providing excellent slot use utility. Another good pick is combining Colony tactical consoles with multiple firing mode dummy procs to get a near constant trickle of strong healing. Damage picks include, once again, either boosts or direct damage. Boosts can be completely passive, active, or a combination of both. While somewhat out of favor in the current meta, passive consoles still provide a constant boost to performance and are still viable in the absence of unconventional systems. Common picks include isomags, locators, assimilated module, bioneural infusion circuits, the colony deflector, and Lorca's custom firing controls. Some examples of active consoles include Adaptive Emergency Systems, which also doubles as a durability console, Gemini device, which also doubles as a direct damage console, and the 2024 winter event ship, the Elios' console, which grants a wide range of buffs, as well as functioning as a passive console that provides a stat boost when slotted. Direct damage picks are also fit in at the same time, prioritized by effectiveness. Standard picks include the Agony Redistributor module and the Micro Quantum Phalanx Array, as well as the Discovery Dex 3-piece, among many others. Utility picks are not very common, but can be a cornerstone to a build. A major example is the aforementioned Voven console.
And making an appearance again is the Elios' console, providing a passive bridge officer cooldown reduction, which is quite useful. The Dex setup converts 1-to-1 in nearly every case. The main exception is if you want to move a build to or from a science vessel. You'll have to add or remove a secondary deflector. This is notable for Dusai, which benefits from having a secondary deflector. When it comes to building the deflector engine core and shield setup, or DEX setup, there's really only a few options that two builds need to consider. The Discovery 2-piece is completed in one way or another, typically with the core and shield, for its massive durability boost. Sometimes you use the deflector and shield, or impulse engines and shield, but these are less common. Some builds might use the Discovery 3 piece for its first shot damage spike as well. You might complete that with the deflector with the core and shield. I see the 4-piece used a lot, but honestly, I do not consider that to be a worthwhile choice. When it comes to impulse engines, there's really only one option, and that's the competitive impulse engines. They provide a proc that generates a massive speed boost on the level of evasive maneuvers. This is vital for positioning power. Positioning is all. This game requires you be places, and this will get you there. While there are other combinations and options for niche building, this is the standard pick. However, it does take some time to get, so I often recommend the Braden Reconnaissance Impulse engines as your stopgap filler build. Also in the realm of beginner stuff, the Crystal Matrix Shield from Parapassum is a really good starter kit. When it comes to deflectors, you're either using, as I mentioned before, possibly the Discovery deflector or the Fleet Colony Intervention deflector for its really solid critical stats. A shield that's been making appearances at the high end these days is the Kittimer shield for its retaliation damage. If you're building for the high end, this is a massive damage source. As I said, there's a lot of other combos out there, but we're not going to go into depth in this video.
Traits are pretty straightforward since slots are largely not unique to a ship. The same classifications as before fit here: damage, durability, and utility. If your cooldown strategy requires trait slots, those get priority. Then you balance out the other two depending on what you have access to, or 1-to-1 if you have all the required stuff. You can make modifications based on taste, trading off damage for durability, or vice versa.
There are so many traits in this game, so I'm only really going to mention the most important ones for do. The firing mode extenders. For Scatter Volley, there's Withering Barrage. For Rapid Fire, there's Go for the Kill. Fire at Will has a plethora of options, but the most common is Entwined Tactical Matrices. Beam Overload has Super Weapon Ingenuity, and the Specialization firing modes has Vanguard Specialists. Your priority should be getting one of these. Once you have them, everything else is just either stacking damage or specializing into a subtype like tanking or do psi.
Finally, transposing duty officers is pretty simple. The majority of Doffs are bad, so you either have access to the good stuff or you don't. If you're using Ox to Bat as a cooldown method, you must slot Technicians first. Emergency Con Hologram basically always goes on, and the remaining spaces can be filled with damage boosting, healing, or utility. Damage options include the Board Security Officers and Energy Weapon Officer crit Doffs. Healing Doffs include Hull Regen Nurses, Dal Royal, and Agent Nerul or Agent Al. Utility Doffs include options like Battery Quartermasters
And firing mode cooldown Doffs.
One thing to note about Doffs is that the majority of them, as I said, are terrible. If you don't have the specific Doffs that work well, you really don't have to pay attention to them. So now that we've gone over the rest of the components of a ship, let's do a few exercises. Let's dive into the deep end and transpose a full build from one ship to one that is quite different under a traditional lens. This is the USS Journeyman, a budget fleet intel Soyuz build. It's based in Polaron and leverages the Morphogenic 3-piece to boost your crit stats, and a Protomatter Infuser and Hull Image Refractor combo to provide a ton of durability while still getting offensive boosts out of it. We stan build efficiency here. This is an Helios. As you can see, it's a scout ship, which is a very light science-focused ship type. You wouldn't think on a first glance that these ships could run the same build, but guess what? They fucking can. Some minor tweaks have to be made, and they're really fucking easy to identify. None of this should be surprising to you once you've figured this shit out. So let's take a look. As a scout, the bridge is almost entirely modular, so we have a lot of leeway here. We can start by moving the firing sequence over. Because we're using the morph set, we need to copy all of the firing modes as well as attack pattern beta. So let's make one of the lieutenant commander slots tactical and do the same with the ensign slot. This lets us fit all we need. As usual, we maximize our primary firing mode, scatter volley, and fit beta. After that, we fit the 2 dummy procs needed for morph to function, and typically you slot these in at as low of a rank as you possibly can to maximize space. These dummy procs also double as procs for the competitive innervated impulse engines. It is, as I said, always great when we can be as efficient as possible and get as much utility out of a slot as you can. Next, we fit our emergency power chain. I'm going to choose Lieutenant Commander seat so that I can move over reverse shield polarity as well. Finally, we come to our biggest change. The Elios has a dedicated Commander Science seat. We can upgrade Gravity Well to 3 on this build, giving us even greater field control. This gives us room for Photonic Officer 2 instead of 1, tightening our cooldowns. We can move over Jam and Tractor to function as procs for Pilfered Power. And since they're both Intel ships, we can keep Override Subsystem CFDs as a spike ability. Finally, we have one more free science slot. We can slot Stabilizing Resonance Beam, proccing the ship's secondary deflector for more damage, since we have it. Now, let's look at the gear. There are more consoles in the Science Edition than the others, meaning that we're probably going to have to make a trade-off somewhere. In this case, we're going to drop one isomag so that we can maintain the integrity of our proto-matter durability machine. Instead, we'll pick up a universal damage console, in this case the assimilated module. It fills the same role as a mag, increasing damage output. In this way, you can make trades simply by classifying the job of a console and picking from any number of consoles that do the same job, but maybe just not as well. This also doubles utility by completing the KCB 2-piece, which we did on the Journeyman by using an Afto Megatorp. Since there's fewer weapon slots on the Elios, this is a really convenient change. There is also a secondary deflector, which we simply accounted for with Stabilizing Resonance Beam. In the end, we didn't really change much of anything. We swapped out one damage console for another, and we reorganized the components of the bridge a bit. But the build is fundamentally intact. You can do this with anything within Do, because as I said, ships are all fundamentally the fucking same. So let's recap. Builds can be broken down into components. These components are consistent across an archetype. Builds can be transposed from one ship to another by using these components. And components have their layout changed to match a different ship's layout, but they fundamentally remain the same if done correctly. I'm gonna go on a little bit of a rant here. This isn't scripted. I'm really tired. I've been doing this since 2016, and general build knowledge in the community has not proliferated. Bigger YouTubers post builds, and people look at it and ask, well, how does this apply elsewhere? It's really not that fucking hard. With what we've looked at here, you are now armed with the ability to never ever need to ask for a ship-specific build ever again. I mean, this stuff isn't that complicated. Sure, there's a massive library in my head of all of the things that can be used to substitute, but the fundamental concept that all of these things are the same shouldn't be that complicated to understand. I don't think y'all are stupid. Sometimes I get a little cynical and a little frustrated, but I mean, we're nerds. We're fucking nerds, and when we look at these things, we should be having fun instead of just taking and demanding that other people do our work. This shit is a lot more simple than it looks, and I really, really want you guys to learn, because spoon feeding completed things doesn't help anyone, because what ends up happening is that you clone builds and don't understand why you're not doing the same kinds of output, the same kind of performance, and you get frustrated. I've seen it time and time again. But if you take the time to understand the core concepts, you can understand how these things work, why a ship functions, and actually make it sing for you.
I don't understand.
You have to learn why things work on a starship. Each ship has its own combination code to prevent an enemy from doing what we're attempting.
We've covered all the fundamentals here. We've broken down all of the components of a build, and we've practiced transposition. I hope you can see that everything is plug and play. It's all the same stuff. It's just fit into place a bit differently. And this game doesn't teach as well as it should, or at all. There's this concept that I call deceptive modularity. It gives you the idea that anything can go anywhere, and they really can't. As I've said before, games have rules, whether the developers intended for them to be there or not. Emergent design is a thing. These things work together in unexpected ways, and we've had more than a decade of all of these systems interacting. So there are correct ways to do things. There are incorrect ways to do things. I've heard the "but my playstyle" statement made over and over again, and it's not a playstyle to have a goddamn mess, to have stuff that doesn't work together, to just be pressing random shit and expecting results. I know I'm probably coming off as a little bit elitist here, but I mean, I play this game way too much. It is the one game I play. I am hyper-focused on it, so I don't expect you all to be able to do things at the same level of skill and intensity. But I don't know, the goal of my channel is to make it so that people can learn and grasp these things on a basic level and do things for themselves. I'm gonna cut this rant off because I'm just gonna start rambling, but hopefully this video has been a first step in a new culture of understanding that I want to foster. I know that I can be a little abrasive, but that's just, me. So, candid, raw Mara over.